I threw a woman out of my car in the middle of the street. And I just drive right past it. That's what you're saying. I don't know how to respond to that.
I'm not asking you to respond. I just need you to know that I know.
Cliff, I know this wasn't easy for you. You came to me as a friend. I appreciate it.
You can start today, Howard.
Oh, I will. Because you're right. I do have a problem. Just not the problem you think. I have a Jimmy McGill problem.
Jimmy McGill?
You'll have to excuse me.
Howard!
Julie, cancel my week. Yes, my whole week.
If it's your first time here, hey, my name is Quentin. I'm a writer, teacher, and sometimes performer. Better Call Saul, the spin-off and prequel to Breaking Bad. You know, the show about a high school chemistry teacher manufacturing drugs to provide for his family with the help of a certain criminal lawyer named Saul Goodman. Better Call Saul follows the moral decline of lawyer Jimmy McGill, as we witness how people in his life, his tendency to scam, and the inaccessible world of law morph him into the criminal lawyer persona of Saul Goodman, who we first meet in Breaking Bad during its second season. Better Call Saul celebrates its 10th anniversary this year, and since it's become my new favorite piece of narrative media, I thought it was time for another good old-fashioned analysis. In my first video essay, I examined the symbolic visual motif of placing Jimmy McGill near electric sources of light, and what it represented in the first episode specifically. I really believe that light sources, whether natural or artificial as seen in the show, represents the moral grayness of law in today's society, among other possible interpretations. Natural light generally harkens back to biblical Old Testament ideals associated with light, including sanctity, goodness, wisdom, and justice. Artificial light generally harkens back to Enlightenment ideals associated with light, including independent thought, bravery, rebellion, and relying on one's own wits. Jimmy is placed near electric sources of light because he represents a post-Enlightenment attitude towards light as a symbol for the rule of law. Jimmy is incredibly independent, though not always by choice, as well as brave, rebellious, and he relies heavily on his wits, or as Tuco puts it, his mouth. Chuck cannot tolerate electric light sources, only natural light from the sun or from fire. Thus he represents a biblical attitude towards light as a symbol for the rule of law. Chuck is heavily motivated by the sanctity of the law in his eyes, along with concerns for goodness, wisdom, and appropriate justice, hence believing that Jimmy will only abuse the sanctity of the law if he succeeds as a lawyer. Chuck is old school and natural, whereas Jimmy is morally flexible and electric. Chuck works for the law, whereas Jimmy makes the law work for him. Chuck's aversion to anything electric and the constant cinematic compositions of Jimmy nearby electric lights communicates this difference in attitude towards the law visually. If you want a greater expansion on this, check out my first video essay. For this video essay, I wanted to take this analysis one step further, this time focusing on a key element, or rather character, often overlooked yet very caught in the middle of the feud between Chuck McGill and Jimmy McGill. Howard Hamlin, senior partner and co-founder of Hamlin, and McGill, HHM. Now when people talk about the character of Howard, it often comes down to, wait a second, wait, hold on. Stop watching this video now if you haven't seen season 6. I'll give you 4 seconds. You've been warned. Anyways, when talking about Howard, it often comes down to the unfair tragedy of his death in season 6, how awful he was to Kim by keeping her in doc review at HHM, how awful he was to Jimmy by always siding with Chuck over keeping him out of the firm, or if he can even be considered a good person within the world of the show. With the exception of Marie Schrader and Stacey Ermintrout, Howard Hamlin is the only character in the entire Breaking Bad universe to seek out therapy to voluntarily face his problems. Keep in mind, this is a universe where characters would rather lie, steal, kill, or scheme against others in order to deal with their internal or external problems. Does Howard come close to doing anything remotely like that? Think about that for a second. But moving that moral consideration aside, one often underappreciated aspect of Howard's character is his being in the middle of Chuck and Jimmy, and his being in the midst of their feud comes to its ultimate culmination in Howard's final scenes with each McGill brother, especially if we look again at the symbolic leitmotif along with the narrative technique of mirroring. Ultimately, through this continuation of the leitmotif along with the use of mirroring, both Chuck and Jimmy inadvertently take out their animosity towards each other onto Howard, both achieving a financial win at the expense of his well-being and at the expense of dealing with their own personal issues. Chuck gets his buyout from HHM, Jimmy gets his share of the Sandpiper Crossing settlement earlier, but they obliterate Howard in the process. This character triad ultimately connects to one of the central themes in both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, the process of moral disengagement, an increasingly relevant phenomenon in today's world, I would argue. More on that later. Let's get into it. But before we can actually get into analyzing the last scene between Chuck and Howard and the last scene between Jimmy and Howard and Kim, we have to quickly touch on 3 cinematic and narrative techniques. Framing and composition were discussed in the last video essay, but I'm going to review it again here. Framing is the proportions of what we see on a screen, the specific angle or point of view we see things from. Think of it as a formal element, how something is communicated in film. Composition is what we see within the frame, the people, objects, shapes, or settings. Think of it as the element of content, what is communicated in a film. While framing and composition are visual cinematic techniques, mirroring is more of a storytelling technique. Characters, scenes, and plot elements within a single story or series of stories can mirror each other. In other words, they can connect and complement each other by establishing a common recurrence in plot, character, or dialogue, yet not strictly being the same. For example, in the famous Breaking Bad episode Ozymandias, it opens with a flashback to the protagonist Walter White coming up with his first lie to his wife Skylar, while obviously manufacturing drugs. This opening flashback mirrors a later scene where Walt tries to lie to Skylar about the death of their brother-in-law Hank. To quote an article from Scribophile, quote, "Mirror plots or scenes are achieved by setting up pairs of opposites and/or complementary scenes that share emotional resonance," end quote. In the case of those aforementioned scenes from Breaking Bad, both are complementary scenes that share emotional resonance, since we have an earlier scene of Walt telling his very first lie to his wife about his drug business, complemented with a later scene of Walt trying yet again to lie to his wife about the violent nature of his drug business. Both scenes are similar, but take place under different circumstances and in different time periods. Thus, they mirror each other rather than copying each other. They mirror each other to demonstrate to the audience the moral decline of Walter White over the course of the series. In other words, mirroring is a narrative technique to draw our attention to something relevant within the plot, the story, the characters, or the themes. Something so relevant that it demands repeating under different yet similar circumstances. Now, let's really get started. Major spoiler warning for Better Call Saul. If you haven't seen the entire series, then I would suggest finishing it before checking out this video. Viewer, beware. Now, before we can truly get into it, we need to briefly discuss the relationship between Charles McGill and Howard Hamlin. There's a lot I could say about their relationship, but I'll try to keep my analysis as focused as possible. In terms of the relevance of their relationship for this analysis, an important question we have to ask is, why does Howard go along with Chuck's demands and desires for so long? Well, to begin with, Chuck is Howard's mentor. There's no doubt about that. In terms of Chuck being a father or an older brother figure to Howard, I don't really get that sense between them, but Chuck is certainly a legal mentor to Howard. He tutored him to help him pass the state bar exam, he helped him and his father, George Hamlin, build the firm, and after George's death, Chuck and Howard worked together to keep the firm running, and running successfully for 18 years. They certainly have a decent professional relationship and personal friendship. You can tell that Howard really cares about Chuck, just as much as Jimmy. Now, after Chuck bailed Jimmy out of jail time, he asked Howard if HHM would hire him in the mailroom to give him a chance at turning over a new leaf. When Jimmy passed the state bar exam and became eligible to practice law, Chuck told Howard that he couldn't work at HHM as a lawyer. Howard took the blame for Jimmy not being hired, not even giving a hint that Jimmy's own brother didn't want him to work at the firm in such a role. Howard takes the blame again when years later, Chuck still insists Jimmy cannot work at HHM as a lawyer, even after bringing in a large class action lawsuit. A class action lawsuit that will come up again as an important plot point between Jimmy and Howard. So why does Howard do this? It's actually not super complicated in my opinion. Chuck is Howard's mentor, the person who's helped him run HHM for years, and one of its founding partners. It's not that Howard agrees with Chuck's attitude towards Jimmy, but rather he trusts his judgment and is willing to take the blame to keep Chuck happy and to keep HHM running smoothly. As opposed to the way Chuck feels about Jimmy, Howard actually trusts Chuck, and more importantly, he trusts his judgment. That is, until Season 3, Episode 5, Chicanery. This is not only considered one of the greatest episodes of the series, but it marks a turning point in the character dynamics between Jimmy, Chuck, and Howard. After Jimmy proves in his own disbarment hearing that Chuck's sensitivity to electricity is in his mind, this happens.
You think this is bad? This chicanery? He's done worse. That's billboard. Are you telling me that a man just happens to fall like that? No, he orchestrated it. Jimmy. He defecated through a sunroof.
In front of everyone. In the end, the New Mexico Bar Association suspends Jimmy for a year from practicing law. Nothing happens to Chuck professionally, but psychologically he realizes he needs to deal with his psychosomatic illness. Now, do the McGill brothers finally stop messing with each other? Chuck does stop, but Jimmy, struggling financially now that he isn't practicing law, purposely tells the insurance company that his brother had a meltdown in public. So with this newfound knowledge, Chuck's malpractice insurance premiums increase, which motivates Howard to encourage Chuck to retire since it would be too expensive for the firm to manage. Chuck doesn't take this well at all and threatens to sue HHM for breach of contract, giving them 3 options: buy him out of the firm, be tied up in court forever, or just accept that the insurance premiums will go up and keep Chuck on. Now, do any of these options sound fair or reasonable to Howard or HHM? I didn't think so either. So now, let's get into the actual scene analysis from Season 3, Episode 10, Lantern. We'll be looking at the use of the leitmotif within various shot compositions, as well as some use of narrative mirroring within these compositions, and within the overall dynamic between Chuck and Howard in their last scene. Right away, we see that the electric lamps are turned on as Howard and Chuck are talking. This not only tells us that Chuck has improved to the point where he can comfortably be in a room with electricity, for the most part, but it also tells us that even though Chuck isn't aware of Jimmy's role in making the malpractice insurance go up, his presence is still felt in the room. His electric nature, which Chuck was psychologically allergic to for the longest time, is the root of what has landed him and Howard in this professional/personal disagreement. So while Chuck may be angry at Howard for insisting he retire, the anger should really be placed onto Jimmy. We know this as audience members, but the characters don't, hence the presence of the electric lamps throughout the scene. Much of Howard's initial conversation with Chuck is framed to accentuate the natural sunlight in the room rather than the lamps, as Howard openly tells Chuck how hurtful it was that he would even think to sue HHM. Chuck is framed behind the wide window so we can clearly see the natural light emanating in. Remember that Chuck's tolerance of only natural light sources represents his more biblical outlook on law, one that's morally strict rather than morally flexible like Jimmy's. Howard derides Chuck's actions on not any legal or ethical grounds per se, but on the grounds of friendship. Chuck, framed once again near natural light, is told for the first time by someone he actually respects that he is in the wrong, that he's actually not being the upstanding, morally superior officer of the court he thinks he is. So this framing is meant to be slightly contradictory, since he's not really upholding his moral view of the law by threatening to sue his own firm. He's betrayed someone who always stood by his side, which could serve to mirror Chuck's treatment of Jimmy. Chuck betrayed Jimmy by blocking him from HHM twice as a lawyer. In his pursuit to be right and to feel morally superior against his brother, Chuck has now betrayed Howard and the firm he founded. Now, that's not to say Jimmy had the right to mess with his malpractice insurance, but Chuck's reaction to such a surprise comes from the very same vindictive impulse he's demonstrated towards Jimmy. An impulse which is ironically understandable given Jimmy's role in the insurance going up, but is unfortunately put onto the wrong person. The framing of the conversation changes as soon as Howard hands a check to Chuck. Rather than highlighting the scene's natural daylight, now the shot composition goes back to highlighting the electric lamps before them. If you look right here, Chuck is positioned in darkness, just as he has been throughout most of the series. In spite of being closer than ever to an electric light source, Chuck is still heavily associated with natural light and darkness. He may be able to withstand these electric lights now, but he hasn't radically changed as a person. Howard giving this $3 million check to Chuck mirrors another scene in this office that also heavily features these desk lamps. Jimmy bringing in the tattered check meant for Chuck in the very first episode. Chuck taking this check from Howard in response to his threat to sue as they stand next to these electric lamps truly communicates that even though Chuck can now be in the same room as these lamps, he still holds the same contempt for his brother's electric lawyering and is taking it out on Howard. I mean, would Chuck have put up as much of a fight if Jimmy didn't have some involvement in the bar hearing breakdown that would cause his premiums to increase? I don't think so. Chuck is unaware of Jimmy's explicit role in the insurance premiums increase, as I pointed out already, but he still has no further recourse to stop the consequences of Jimmy tricking him at the bar hearing. Thus, any further issues that come about from this feud can only be worked out through Chuck's position as a lawyer. So these lamps are here compositionally to mirror Jimmy's tattering of Howard's original offering to Chuck in the first episode, to clearly remind us of Jimmy's responsibility in this mess, and how Chuck's hostility towards Howard and the firm are misplaced. Jimmy is really the person Chuck should be suing, but he can't. Then we have a close-up of Howard, looking the saddest we've ever seen him up to this point, as he struggles to tell Chuck.
You won.
Chuck does succeed in getting HHM to buy him out of the firm, which was one of the options he laid out, but at the expense of Howard's financial stability, using personal funds and loans to buy him out. But ultimately, Chuck didn't want to be bought out, nor did he really want to sue. He wanted to keep being a lawyer, to get back to work after struggling with a psychosomatic illness, and after being publicly humiliated. Instead, he receives $8 million, is forced to truly retire, and becomes estranged from Jimmy and from Howard. After accepting that he's won, we have a wide angle of Chuck by himself, with the electric lamps next to him on the conference room table. Once again, the compositions throughout this scene want to remind us that Chuck's refusal to accept Jimmy as a lawyer, manifesting as electromagnetic hypersensitivity, have gradually led to this situation. The last few minutes of Chuck at HHM feature him standing directly under 3 visible light sources as Howard, both earnestly and I think a little passive-aggressively, announces his retirement. We have yet another composition featuring Chuck, a morally strict lawyer, standing near electric lights rather than the usual natural lights. The final series of shots we see of Chuck in the building have him descending the staircase with sharp, blinding natural sunlight waiting for him outside. He walks away from the electric lighting of the firm he helped create and back into his self-imposed, naturally lit moral superiority, you could say. He's made himself better enough to withstand all these electric lights, but again, not better enough to work out his relationship with Jimmy. Chuck is forced out of his firm because he ultimately couldn't let his brother go. And Jimmy, aka Saul Goodman, will succumb to a similar fate only 3 seasons later. Keeping that scene from the episode Lantern in mind, let's discuss the final scene between Jimmy, Kim, and Howard in Season 6, Episode 7, Plan and Execution. Of course, we should discuss the relationship between Jimmy McGill and Howard Hamlin briefly to provide context to this scene analysis. An important question to ask in regards to this scene analysis is, why does Jimmy harass Howard so much? And equally important, why do both Jimmy and Kim Wexler harass him so much? When Jimmy first began working in the mailroom at HHM, Howard was impressed with his work ethic. So when Howard eventually told him that he wouldn't be hired at HHM anytime soon as a lawyer, it was incredibly hurtful. Obviously, Jimmy would have a strong dislike for Howard after something like that. As far as he knew for years, Howard was the one who prevented him from getting a chance to work at HHM. Eventually learning the truth and trying to make some amends with Howard, though it's not like they have an amazing relationship after that. It's not bad, but it's also definitely not good. Later, Jimmy openly admits at Howard's funeral that he was jealous of the respect he received from Chuck. Obviously, that jealousy never faded. Those are only some of the reasons why Jimmy starts harassing Howard. We'll get back to other reasons in a second. We also need to talk about Kim Wexler, fellow lawyer at HHM and Jimmy's longtime girlfriend. What does she have against Howard? You can definitely say Howard doesn't treat Kim very well as a boss, sending her to document review 2 times and keeping her there even after landing a big client. Kim is also clearly insulted by Howard trying to caution her about Jimmy's inclination towards erratic, irresponsible actions. What erratic, irresponsible actions? Well, after Chuck's death, Howard ends up doing some personal work, processing his grief and other issues through therapy. He offers Jimmy a job at HHM just at the point when Jimmy is really getting into Saul Goodman territory. It's kind of a crossroads for Jimmy. He could take the job at HHM and be a successful lawyer in that regard, or he can continue down his current path and represent criminals and people on the other side of the law. Jimmy is resentful of Howard's ability to move on from Chuck's death, since at this point he's not even close to truly processing the death of his brother. Not to mention again, Howard always had Chuck's respect, whereas Jimmy never had it. So Jimmy takes out his anger and his inability to process onto Howard by throwing bowling balls on his car and sending sex workers to his lunch as if he owes them money when obviously he doesn't. Kim hears about these pranks from Howard and starts to want to get in on it, suggesting other ways they can mess with him, eventually landing on the idea of what if they mess with Howard so badly that the other lawyers on the Sandpiper Crossing case would want to settle quickly, and therefore Jimmy and Kim would get their share of the common fund earlier. Jimmy feels a little uneasy about such a plan to take Howard's reputation down, but Kim feels justified in taking him down for the sake of using the money to open up a pro bono practice. Jimmy, deep down wanting Kim's approval as much as he wanted Chuck's, agrees to it, for the sake of their connection over conning people. Jimmy is emotionally a stand-in for Kim's mother, a con artist, and Kim is emotionally a stand-in for Chuck, a lawyer. So what do? Well, they make Howard look like a cocaine addict through various schemes and plans, culminating in Howard awkwardly accusing the case mediator of taking a bribe from Jimmy, only to have the photos switched. Thus, the Sandpiper case is forced to settle right then and there because of the pure embarrassing nature of it all. Of course, Howard knows Jimmy and Kim are responsible for making him appear this way and making the case settle for less money than hoped for, yet still being plenty for the two of them to justify their actions. So why do they both harass him? It starts off with Jimmy lashing out at Howard over unprocessed jealousy and anger to do with Chuck's death, then Kim's dislike for him growing as she becomes morally disengaged, and eventually justifying their harassment of him for the sake of forcing Sandpiper to settle by framing him as a drug-addicted lawyer. But really, it's because they both enjoy fucking with people, especially those they see as having more power and privilege than them. Howard is someone they both have enough history with, and someone privileged enough to bounce back from the damage, so to them, he is the ideal mark. They don't hate his guts per se, but they dislike him enough to not care what professional or personal damage is done to him. And this is where we find ourselves in this final scene between Jimmy, Kim, and Howard. Once again, we'll be looking at the use of what I would now call the signature leitmotif through framing and compositions, but this time featuring more natural light as opposed to the usual electric lighting sources. And here's the thing, there's only one natural lighting source in the whole scene. You know what I'm talking about, it's the candle. We'll also touch on the use of mirroring again within the use of dialogue, within some compositions, and within the overall character dynamics. Let's begin with the fact that the first shot of this scene is an extreme close-up on the candle. We'll see a later angle of the flame flicker at the force of their apartment door opening and Howard entering to confront them. So right away, we know this candle is important. It's given the same level of visual importance as electric lighting sources, given the various compositions featuring it. This slightly mirrors Howard's last scene with Chuck, in which those electric lamps in the HHM conference room were important symbolic elements within the scene, only this time it's a natural lighting source. The other interesting aspect in relation to the candle is the fact that all throughout the scene, visible electric lighting sources are less prominent compared to other compositions from the series. They're still there, but is it just me, or is that candle really eye-catching compared to other light sources in the room? The lighting in the room has an edgy, warm yellow glow, almost as if the characters are by a campfire. With the compositions framing the candle and the overall lighting, it's definitely made to appear as if the whole room is lit by natural light. We'll come back to the candle again soon. But let's first talk about the way Howard begins this confrontation. He doesn't yell, break down their door, or even outright accuse them. He brings up Chuck instead, mentioning how he and Chuck would celebrate a big victory with a glass of very expensive Macallan whiskey. So in a passive-aggressive tribute to Jimmy and his brother, Howard offers the bottle to him and says,
You won.
Of course, using the exact words he said to Chuck when Howard was forced to buy him out personally to save the firm.
You won.
This scene clearly mirrors that final scene with Chuck, only this time Howard has lost more than financial stability. He's lost his reputation as a respectable, people-oriented lawyer. When he says this, both Jimmy and Kim are framed to accommodate subtle electric lights above them, mostly Jimmy, as well as the candle below on the table. Of course, we all remember the connection between Jimmy and electric lights, but within a matter of seconds, the presence of Chuck McGill is in the room thanks to the emphasizing of the natural candlelight as opposed to electric lights, along with the mirroring of Howard's words to both McGill brothers.
You won. You won.
Jimmy, having agreed to this long con against Howard, is now being rewarded, ironically, with whiskey his morally stiff brother used to drink to celebrate a legal victory. Very, very ironic. Howard begins to list off all of the reasons why Jimmy and Kim would want to sabotage his reputation, and what's one of the first things he can think of?
I sided with Chuck too often?
Similar to the way Chuck couldn't escape Jimmy's electric presence when having a similar confrontation with Howard, Jimmy can't escape his brother and how their unresolved feud has indirectly landed him in this situation. Jimmy mostly agreed to this con in order to keep Kim, an intelligent, respected attorney, happy, the exact way he attempted to keep Chuck happy by becoming a lawyer and managing his illness. Jimmy, like Chuck in the scene from Season 3, can't see the connection between him screwing Howard over and his own unresolved animosity towards his brother. So here you have even more mirroring between the Chuck-Howard dynamic and the Jimmy-Howard dynamic. Chuck screwed Howard over by forcing him to personally pay out his share of the firm because Chuck couldn't handle retiring as a result of his brother's chicanery. Jimmy screwed Howard over by making him look like a drug addict because Jimmy deep down couldn't handle the psychological disapproval from Kim, who was the driving force behind the plan. In fact, Jimmy only started harassing Howard personally because he was avoiding dealing with Chuck's death. Both brothers take out their issues with each other onto Howard in obvious and not so obvious ways. Now, getting back to the candle, as Howard continues to confront them, he eventually lands on an obvious question.
What allows you to do this to me? Because this isn't just a prank. No, this goes beyond throwing bowling balls on my car. This took planning, coordination. I mean, how many weeks? So tell me, why? Why go through this elaborate plot just to burn me to the ground?
In this composition, Howard is facing Jimmy and Kim while they have their backs turned away from our view, with that candle still burning brightly just below them. In this shot, the impact of Jimmy and Kim's actions takes center stage, hence why Howard is the only character framed. Howard asks them why they went to so much effort to burn him to the ground. Now right here, we have both an obvious and a subtle connection to Chuck. The subtle connection being that a tiny natural fire, a candle, is in frame when Howard asks this, and the obvious connection being that Howard's insistence that they burnt him to the ground mirrors Chuck's unaliving at the end of Season 3, Episode 10, the episode with the very scene I was analyzing earlier. God, there's so many connections between these two scenes, it's making my head spin. I'm wondering if I even caught them all. This mirroring through dialogue and shot composition again serves as a reminder of who Jimmy's battle really is with, Chuck, not Howard. Howard mentions Chuck by name again when he brings up that Jimmy was born a soulless person, saying Chuck knew Jimmy couldn't help himself, then expressing shock and disgust at Kim for choosing to be like Jimmy. It's at this moment that Jimmy tries to convince Howard to leave, offering to call him a cab. This final mention of Chuck, along with Howard turning against Kim, seems to spur Jimmy into a bit of a caretaking mode, a mode he found himself in when looking after Chuck. Once again, Chuck's presence simply cannot be avoided in this confrontation. When Howard declares that they can't hide who they really are, we have a final close-up of the flickering candle, but this time, someone else has entered the apartment. That would be Lalo Salamanca, a member of the drug cartel business Jimmy has gradually been working for. This candle primarily serves as a visual reminder for Chuck's indirect role in Jimmy deciding to go along with Kim's plan for Howard, for Jimmy's misguided animosity towards Howard, and the mirroring of Howard's undeserved conflict with another McGill lawyer. Instead of natural Chuck McGill, Howie has to deal with electric Jimmy McGill. But in both confrontation scenes, each brother is surrounded by symbols of the other brother. Chuck is surrounded by table lamps, and Jimmy keeps eyeing that little candle. But there's one more aspect to the candle that most of you probably already knew about. Lalo loves fire. And when that candle flickers from the force of the door opening a second time, we know that the time is up. Finally, Jimmy's underground world and the legitimate world of lawyers he was excluded from come crashing into each other head on, and Howard is shot almost instantly by Lalo in front of Jimmy and Kim. We don't see a composition of the natural candlelight for the rest of the episode, just the horror of Howard being killed for merely being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jimmy and Kim get their share of the Sandpiper money, though Kim rejects it out of guilt. Their con was successful, but they never could have imagined Howard dying. Howard's murder is staged as a suicide, and Jimmy and Kim never have to confront it again, unless they want to risk being put in danger, though Kim does end up confessing to Howard's widow years later. Jimmy, like Chuck, was financially rewarded even when it meant going against Howard. But we all know that's not what Jimmy really wanted. Jimmy couldn't stop harassing Howard because he couldn't quite get over Chuck. So when presented with the opportunity from Kim to keep doing it, Jimmy, seeking approval from the emotional surrogate of his brother, of course went along with it. Jimmy messed with Howard's character and life to gain money and approval he was always seeking, but no amount of money or approval from Kim could make him truly get past the unresolved relationship he had with his own brother. Chuck and Jimmy just couldn't escape each other, even after death. Right now you might be asking, what's the point of all this? Through shot compositions and framing, we've established that Jimmy's morally flexible view / utilization of the law is symbolized by placing him with electric lights, whereas Chuck's morally strict view / utilization of the law is symbolized by placing him with natural lights and being averse to electricity. We explored this in some detail in my previous video, but we never examined any characters caught in the crossfire, the clearest example being Howard Hamlin. In terms of how the series communicates the impacts the McGill brothers feud has on Howard, we can look again to the use of framing / composition to perpetuate the moralistic meanings associated with electric and natural sources of light as a representation for the rule of law. But we can also look to mirroring through framing / composition, dialogue, and overall character dynamics. Chuck and Jimmy may not have had a lot in common as brothers, except both excelling in the legal field, but they did share an equal amount of spite and animosity towards each other, spite and animosity placed eventually onto the wrong person. Both brothers achieve a financial victory at the expense of Howard's well-being and at the expense of dealing with their own issues. Chuck gets his buyout, Jimmy gets his share of the Sandpiper Crossing settlement earlier, but like I said, they obliterate Howard in the process. So you could say both brothers win from a financial perspective, but they lose from a moral perspective. Ultimately, this character triad connects to one of the central themes in both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, the process of moral disengagement. Moral disengagement is defined as, quote, the process of convincing the self that ethical standards do not apply to oneself in a particular context, end quote. One notable way a person becomes morally disengaged is to, quote, portray inhumane behavior as though it has a moral purpose in order to make it socially acceptable, end quote. In other words, if an unethical action carries a moral purpose, then it's okay to commit said action. You can already infer how the experience of becoming morally disengaged with societal ethics and the people around you is relevant in both series. Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul deal with the gradual moral disengagement of their respective protagonists. You might think moral disengagement only applies to Jimmy, but nope, it applies to Chuck as well. Jimmy and Chuck's moral engagement as lawyers is symbolized by the leitmotif that I just won't shut the fuck up about. Electric Jimmy and good old natural Chuck are morally different, but still morally engaged in pursuit of the same mission as lawyers, to help people and to keep society as fair and just as possible. They just go about it in different ways. However, with their continued feud, especially after Chuck blocking Jimmy from HHM a second time, the two increasingly become morally disengaged from themselves, the people around them, and the law to some degree. Unethical actions start to carry a moral purpose, so they feel justified in their actions if it means winning and defeating the other brother. Chuck thinks it's okay to sue the firm he helped build despite the professional / personal hardship on Howard, so long as it means not letting Jimmy's antics force him out. Jimmy thinks it's okay to go along with sabotaging the professional / personal life of Howard, so long as it means keeping Kim's approval, since he couldn't maintain any approval from Chuck, even as a lawyer. The two brothers may have been against each other's moral view of the law, as symbolized by the leitmotif, but they both mirror each other's gradual moral disengagement as seen in the way Howard Hamlin is caught up in their feud and suffers because of it. Howard was meant to be in the middle from a storytelling standpoint, because while making some unideal choices himself, he always kept a level head and actively tried to be a better person. He wasn't confined to one extreme or the other, whereas Jimmy and Chuck were far more unbalanced. So when I say this candle in Better Call Saul means way more than you think, I often think that it's a shame that Chuck, Jimmy, Kim, and Howard couldn't all just stay morally engaged and enjoy an old movie by candlelight? Is that too corny? Should I really end it like that? Thank you so much for watching. Everything I just said is only my opinion and my own analysis. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much.